I have the pleasure of introducing our next moderator. Michael Miller is a distinguished lecturer of political science and the Deputy Director of the Moynihan Center at City College of New York, where he leads the Moynihan Public Scholars Fellowship. Miller is also a scholar of media, technology, politics, with a focus on the way the authoritarian regimes have adopted modes of information control, censorship, surveillance, propaganda, to digital media environments. Prior to joining CCNY, Miller was a program director at the Social Science Research Council, which leads the Just Tech Fellowship, where he led the Media and Democracy program and the Just Tech program. He also served as the chief editor for the Just Tech platform, and Miller received his PhD in political science from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, UNI. So please welcome Michael Miller.
As Sandra said, my own research is about repression and the kind of dialectic between liberation technology and potentially repressive technology. And I started my dissertation right after the Obama election and right before the Arab Spring. And so this is like the apex of enthusiasm and optimism, I think, about the liberating potential of new media technology. And I wrote about how, in fact, states have really important and powerful means to control societies. And did my research on China. But I, in kind of thinking about how to tee up this panel, I was reminded of that period of time. And even before that, I was reminded of this quote by Bill Clinton, where he's describing, he's comparing the ability to, control societies on the internet to trying to nail Jello to a wall. And he goes, good luck, right? And that's where I think, I want to pick up this conversation and really, think about where we are today and what kind of either repressive potential there is or potential to safeguard our democratic institutions. And so I'm delighted to introduce this panel, which includes three esteemed experts on technology and politics. I'll start with Amy Larson, who is the Director of Strategy and Business Management at Microsoft's Democracy Forward team, where she leads the team strategy on cybersecurity, election integrity, disinformation and information integrity, protecting journalism, media literacy, and corporate civic engagement. Small portfolio. Jason Steinhauer is best-selling author, public historian, and podcast host, founder of the History of Communication Institute, creator of History Club, and a global fellow at the Wilson Center. Jason also serves as the founding director of the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And Caitlin Chin, who is a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she researches the societal and geopolitical implications of technological change, analyzing the effects of digital surveillance, competition, and content moderation policies on democratic institutions and gender and racial equity. So really great to be with you all today. And whenever I have a historian on the stage, I want to ask the question, what's really new about this moment that we're in, and are there lessons from history that we can learn from and think about how either governments can co-opt novel technology, governments or bad actors can co-opt novel technology for repressive means, or ways that we might think about safeguarding our democratic institutions. Yeah, you've got 5 minutes. Solve it. Yeah.
So first of all, I just say how thrilled I am to be here. I go to a lot of tech events, and I never see any historians on the panel. Oh. How's this? Yeah, all right. So I'm thrilled to be here because I go to a lot of tech events and I never see historians on the panel, right? It's almost as if in the tech world,
life begins at 2016 and everything before then like didn't happen, right? But actually like history has a lot to contribute to this conversation. And I've made this argument to David several times, and so I'm thrilled to be here. I feel like I'm speaking for my species, so hopefully we'll get invited back to future events. I will say this, in terms of the question about lessons, one can draw any number of different lessons from the past, depending on how you look at it and how you interpret it. I will say that one lesson we could draw is that Silicon Valley and tech has some autocratic tendencies embedded within it, and those tendencies are now on all of the devices that are on all of our phones all around the world. So that's one lesson. But let me actually intervene here with a short story, because that might help frame the way I think about this. So I was in Berlin last year for a conference, and in Berlin, they have an institution, a museum called the Stasi Museum. Now, before I go any further, do people know what the Stasi is? A little historical check here. Okay, so we have some historical literacy in the room, right? Okay, so when you go to the Stasi Museum, you go through this amazing exhibition where you see the history of the GDR and the tactics that were used by the Ministry of State Security to surveil and censor and repress people. Okay, so what were those tactics? Well, they had cameras on all the street corners that were monitoring and recording where people go, who they meet with, what buildings are coming in and out of. They have listening devices in people's homes that are picking up their conversation, who they talk to, who they interact with, what their sentiment is. They have devices that are on the street that take pictures surreptitiously, that capture people at moments when they're not expecting it. And the whole system is undergirded by this idea of loyalty and reward. So the more loyal you are to the state, the more reward you get: nice house, nanny, free education. And the minute you turn against the state, you get punished with reputation damage, right? So I go through the Stasi Museum and I walk out, and suddenly this epiphany occurs to me. We have all this now. We have cameras on every street corner, especially in New York and DC, where my wife and I spend most of our time. We have listening devices in our phones, in our pockets, everywhere we go. We have devices that take pictures of us at all times. We have all this information going back to companies and to governments, being monitored in ways that we don't know the full extent of for the transparency reasons that were mentioned earlier. And none of us voted for this. I mean, I don't remember going to any city council meeting and telling DC government or New York government it was okay to record me everywhere I go, or going to all these companies and telling them they could take all this data from me. I guess I signed some user agreement at some point when I first logged on in 2008 that allowed them to do this, that they've kept updating from time to time. So this world that we fought against so vigorously and so vehemently during the Cold War to stop from happening has now been entered into all of our lives under the guise of convenience or security or just corporate greed. And I would say that that's a sobering thing for us all to think about, right? And I'm not equating the US government or the Canadian government with the Stasi, although if you look at some of the tactics that are done in places like China or Thailand or Turkey or Egypt or Syria, there are some really unsettling similarities, much of what is enabled by the tech that we've created here in this country. So I would say, what lessons do we have to draw? They're infinite. But I think even just by expanding the aperture of where we look for the lessons, right? Not just going back to 2016 or 2008, but even further, it starts to expand the viewpoint on the questions we can ask ourselves about what world we're creating.
Thanks for that, Jason. You want to weigh in here?
How's this? Okay, perfect. So I am not a historian, so for me,
Nobody's perfect.
So for me, life starts after 2016. But I would say that one of my big takeaways from the past few years is that we should not wait for some big event to happen before considering what strong technology policy should look like. After the 2016 election, many people in the United States and around the world were understandably surprised to find that technology platforms are able to collect very detailed, very massive scopes of personal information and process or share this information in ways that we might not expect or want. And that led to huge amounts of interest in Congress, in the media. Tech CEOs came before Congress, attended hearings and said that they would invest in content moderation systems. Twitter announced that it would pause political advertising, but then the news cycle changed. And now in 2023, we still don't have federal privacy legislation. There's been a lot of progress made since 2016, but some of this momentum has definitely stalled. Twitter has reversed its policy on political advertising under Elon Musk. We still don't have clear transparency rules. So I would just say that my big takeaway for the past few years is we shouldn't let the momentum die. We should still keep talking about what responsible governance looks like, whether it's how platforms collect, process, and share personal information, whether that's ways to prevent platforms from taking actions that are anti-competitive or that could potentially cause harm to users, and what responsible algorithm development looks like as well.
Thanks. And maybe I should have started with this question, but and I'm thinking now that I should have. But I want to hear from each of you, and maybe starting with you, Amy, about what you think are the biggest threats to liberal democracy born of tech. And I guess I'll ask the question this way. One, what are the biggest threats now? And what are the kind of looming threats on the horizon that maybe folks aren't thinking about as critically as they should be right now?
Sure, happy to jump in here. Can people hear me? Yeah, awesome. And thank you as well for hosting. Really excited to be with you all. I love to be making history on this panel with a historian. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. In any case, it's a really big question, a really difficult one. I would never pretend to have all the answers to either the entirety of the problem or the sort of suite of solutions. So it's always a work in progress, I think. I'll be happy to share some of my thoughts and also generally just interested in continuing the conversation here. I'd love to just tell you a little bit about what the Democracy Forward team does at Microsoft. We work to safeguard open and secure democratic processes, promote a healthy information ecosystem, and advance corporate civic responsibility. And those have a lot of the elements that we talked a little bit earlier intermixed into that portfolio. So I think first, thinking back about history and the developments of technology over time, I think of, the fact that technologies generally can be used for good and for ill. I think that's very similar to the sort of generally to the position we find ourselves in now, where often tech is either services or products, I think kind of come out as values agnostic. And then it's sort of up to the developers and the users and the entire ecosystem to shape both their values and the uses to which they're put and provide feedback so that, the pieces of them that have biases obviously built in get worked out ideally over time, algorithms and others. Where are we in the current moment where it meets some of the work of the team that I'm working on? So I think, Microsoft didn't necessarily intend to be sort of on the front lines of some of these issues. I think we'll talk a little bit more later about Microsoft's response to the war in Ukraine and some of the sort of information integrity work that came out of my team and the company and in response to that. But more generally, I think, we see democratic institutions and individual rights and security, we're not just existing in real life world, right? There are digital personas, and that's true for accounts. That's true for institutions. That's true for those that are interacting to support democracy. So, thinking about election officials, journalists, nonprofits, human rights workers. So one of the things we do is to provide account security, obviously at a very sort of technical level, to the accounts of those sort of on the front lines of democracy. And we do that like free of charge, obviously. And thinking about, so that account guard program works across 33 countries, has over 5 million accounts that we protect, as just sort of like the baseline for how we are trying to sort of protect the accounts of those involved in democracy. More generally, I think in particular, we've seen a lot of threats to journalism and journalists recently. The fourth estate obviously is essential to democracy, especially attacks on women journalists. And so we have a suite of programs and partnerships that are really meant to address the physical, legal, and digital security of journalists as well. In terms of some of the bigger picture issues of the journalism ecosystem, we've really invested in a number of sort of local journalism, local newsrooms. I think we see that as a way to obviously understanding the impact that technological disruption has had across a number of industries, journalism being one of them. So one of the things we've tried to do is reinvest in local newsrooms, especially where there are news deserts, which we think of as communities with limited access to credible information. And one of the reasons we focused our efforts and resources there is that we've seen correlations between increased news deserts and more information or disinformation consumption, voter participation declines, polarization increases. And so there are very real links between the information ecosystem that people find themselves in and their inclusion and participation in civics and in politics. So that paired with our effort is not only to do no harm, it's to try to do positive things to support the digital underpinnings of democracy. And as well as, the fact that, the Edelman's Trust Barometer came out recently this year, and it shows that for better or worse, I don't necessarily think this is a good thing, but businesses and employers are still the most trusted source of information, more than a lot of NGOs and governments. And so wanting to do well with that sort of mantle of responsibility, we built a number of resources to increase civic participation, make sure that people have access to, knowing where their polling stations are and being really encouraged to go out and participate in elections, both as voters, as poll workers. And I think we've done some really cool things in that. I'm really excited about that set of our work. We've partnered with like Bing and Xbox. In the 2020 elections, we registered over 146,000 voters in order to increase voter participation. And so that's, a suite of some of the things that we're trying to do in order to use our technology and tools to really sort of shore up what could be a set of weaknesses, but also a set of opportunities to do good.
Thanks for that. Caitlin, Jason, what do you guys see as the greatest threats to liberal democracy?
Hi, I'll just say that often when we talk about threats to democracy, I hear people saying that, or mostly describing threats as foreign authoritarian governments potentially misusing technology for their own nefarious gains. And I will say that threats to democracy do not just come from abroad, they come from within a country as well. Often, some of the biggest threats we hear are how technology can increase abilities for government agencies to engage in surveillance, to potentially spread disinformation. These are problems in the United States as well. In the United States, government agencies are using facial recognition, for example, in airports and law enforcement. Data brokers face very few restrictions on how they share personal information with both domestic and government agencies. So I think one of the biggest threats to liberal democracies is that we just don't have processes in place that govern how platforms and government agencies are able to use these tools and personal information. And more than that, perhaps there isn't even agreement on what these principles should look like. But these technologies are still being deployed and used even before we have clear rules and regulations. So that was a very long way of saying that one of the biggest threats to democracy is that we need boundaries on how technology is used.
Thank you. And I want to come back to this idea that we're putting technology out into the world without actually having a kind of complete understanding of what they do and how we might regulate them in a minute. But Jason, you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I'll be quick.
Yeah, go
First thing I'd say corruption. So if you look at how autocracies work, they thrive on corruption. Look at a place like Russia, look at a place like Hungary, right? And even in the United States, the World Bank actually does a index every year, and you can see that our corruption score is going down, going up, depending on how you frame it. It's not good, okay? That's the moral of the story. And so I would love to see the brilliant people in this room working on anti-corruption tech. What would that look like? That's a great way to strengthen democracy, right? Democracy is supposed to hold people who are in power to account. But corruption undermines that because it keeps those people in power from being held accountable. And it also breeds cynicism and distrust in the system, which makes people slide towards autocrats. So that's one major threat. And the second threat, building on Amy's point, I think not only media and journalism, but media and journalism consolidation, right? I think if you look back in history, you see that democracy thrives on having a diverse media space with lots of different perspectives, lots of different languages, lots of different socioeconomic groups represented. But the way the media, corporate media consolidation works is it crowds out those voices, right? That you see now that local newspapers are struggling as well, but also foreign language newspapers, foreign language media, independent news media. These are all things that need to be strengthened. One of the tech platforms I'm excited to learn more about and I actually use is Substack. And I think Substack is a great way to democratize the media space. And I think if you look, for example, in the 19th century, some of the most valuable information and the valuable reporting came out of African-American newspapers, which at the time were considered an alternative newspaper source, but that's where democracy was thriving even amidst Civil War and other things. So I think we need to invest not just in the New York Times and the Washington Post, but independent alternative media in lots of different communities and lots of different languages.
Thanks. Caitlin, we know that in the hands of corrupt governments, technology can be used to repress people, but we also know that without government intervention, the platforms themselves can be manipulated and be used by bad actors to similarly, I think when we speak about repression, we often think about governments doing it, but we know that online folks, especially folks from marginalized communities, are being harassed, targeted, politicians and bad actors may sow disinformation and distrust in order to manipulate elections, et cetera. So I wonder what you think, and this is a question for the panel, but I'll start with you, Caitlin, are the most important interventions that governments can make in order to safeguard democracy?
Thanks for the question. And that's a really good point that harassment, disinformation, privacy violations, these don't only come from governments. We see harmful actions also coming from individuals or organizations or companies as well. And as to the role of government, I mean, it's still debated. I will say one thing that government should not do, and this was brought up in a previous panel, is government should not be telling people what they can and cannot say, especially if that speech directly relates to them or their political party or their political viewpoints. What governments can do, however, is help companies establish processes by which to promote responsible use of data, by which to increase the transparency of their algorithms and set up systems to monitor risks to society, to prevent disparate impact in their algorithms, to allow users to flag potential illegal or harmful content, and to appeal any content moderation decisions that might affect them as well.
And same question to the rest of the panel, but I also want to ask, given especially in this country, how polarized our politics are, what are things, blue sky, that government might do to intervene to safeguard democracy? But then more specifically, what's possible, especially in a context where our legislators don't want or seem to need to get along?
Well, to the question of what can government do, I'd say in the United States context, at least, is how about putting it on the ballot so we can vote on it? I mean, so much of what happens in the federal government when it comes to data and surveillance and privacy is done in the executive branch. And a lot of this is done by people in civil service positions, whether it be inside Department of Homeland Security or the US Army or State Department or what have you, who are not accountable to the electoral process because they're political appointees or they're civil service and they're there for 20 or 30 or 40 years before they retire. But when we look at our elections and we look at the campaigning that happens, what do we get? We get gripes about critical race theory or complaints about this book or that book. We don't get these issues in front of voters in terms of debates and television coverage and on media coverage and in ways that we can, as a populace, vote on them in ways that we can tell our lawmakers how we feel about them. And so I think that is, for us, at least in the United States context, something that I'd like to see more of. I'd like to see these issues in front of voters each election. And I'd like transparency from the government about the data it's collecting, decisions that are being made inside the executive branch about that data. And I want our elected officials, whether it's Trump or Biden or anybody else, to be transparent with us about the decisions they're making around these things in the national security space and what have you, and that we can, as a populace, debate it locally, regionally, and nationally, and then decide on it when it comes time for elections.
Amy, you want to weigh in here? Or?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say that I think a lot of I think it's a challenge, right? Because there aren't easy answers, and technologies and their negative uses tend to quickly sort of iterate forward. So that's outpacing even an active and committed Congress, I imagine. But I think the European Union has led the way on some of these issues. Microsoft signed on to the European Code of Practice on Disinformation and submitted, our first very robust set of work according with those principles, and that's sort of a lead into the DMA. And so I think there are countries that are really taking up the mantle. A lot of times it's easier to move, I guess, in other places than right here at the moment. So yeah, I mean, I'll just sort of continue from here that I think lacking sort of clear legislation, at least, for example, on the disinformation front, one of the things that Microsoft developed over the last year was a set of information integrity principles. Bless you. That was in response to some of our work on in response to the war in Ukraine, where so I'll sort of get back to that question if that's okay, but kind of circle back.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's talk about this because Microsoft has been in the news this last few weeks or couple of months for launching a generative AI chat bot. Well, ChatGPT first, and then Microsoft reveals, we're using this. And I don't think you have to respond to my policy in that regard, but I want to use that, and especially it seems every day since then, Google or Snapchat or some other, Meta recently is announcing, yes, we have a similar tool that we want to roll out soon. And I want to ask, what is the appropriate role, and especially given your role at Microsoft, for corporations to play in this challenge of safeguarding democratic institutions, especially, and I ask this in a kind of pointed way, the role that these corporations have had in creating some of the problems that we face today. So one, please say a little bit about the work that you do, but also kind of reflect on what's the appropriate role of corporations in this battle to safeguard democracy. And I'll ask the same I ask the same question to the panelists.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's super important to understand that either either because we've chosen or not chosen. I think in this case, for example, with regards to the war in Ukraine, we sort of unintentionally became part of the conversation because the first sort of shots that were fired in the war were actually a cyber attack that was launched the day before, and it was observed in Microsoft headquarters before it was observed anywhere else in the world. And the next day, obviously, the tanks rolled across the border, citing back on that day to a sort of disinformation narrative that they had planted months before as well. So one of the things that we've done is to sort of lay out and shine a light on both the sort of cyber attack landscape as well as the disinformation attack landscape, and to really try to respond both in terms of cyber defenses and tracking and shining a light on disinformation for and influence operations. And then sort of further, we've used our AI to map the destruction of historical sites, hospitals, schools, and shared that with the UN and the International Criminal Court, working with the Amal Clooney Foundation as well to hold Russia accountable for war crimes. So all of these technologies have, again, these multiple uses to which they can be put, depending on the purpose, right? And meanwhile, we tried to, make sure that Xbox was available in Ukrainian. That was something that Russian soldiers asked us, or apologies, Ukrainian soldiers asked us. They said, we can't only be playing Xbox in Russian at the end of our days. So we, sort of are trying to figure out how to answer a wide variety of needs. None of that is anything that was in my job description when I started this role. And so I think it's important to be adaptable, to try to understand the best versions and to create the best versions of technologies when the world and situations call for that, and also to develop a set of principles. So we developed this set of principles in response that involves not monetizing disinformation, upranking authoritative content, downranking bad content, and meanwhile protecting users' freedom of expression. So, which is sort of trying to chart this balance. Like, nobody wants to be in the business of being the arbiter of truth, right? Whether that's government or Microsoft, we don't want to at all. So the best that we've come up with on that front is to say, listen, we're going to give people the tools in order to try to figure out how to be informed consumers. And so we've developed media literacy trainings, Spot the Deepfake quiz in partnership with universities, and then put third-party sort of nutrition labels on content to sort of indicate to what extent content is adhering to accepted journalistic principles. So people will see sort of like a red rated or a green rated label, and then we're sort of hoping that as part of people's interest in consuming this information, that they'd like to consume sort of healthy information, right? So I think we don't want to be too heavy-handed, but we want to set principles for ourselves, especially in the absence of federal legislation. And then we want to try to live by what we've created, but also be receptive to feedback. Sydney is in timeout right now. We're working on it. And that's why it's in a sandbox.
A wild.
So it's, it's beta testing, right? So we didn't unleash it to everyone all at one time because we thought, well, maybe there might be some issues here. So I think that was part of the intention. We've had an Office of Responsible AI for the last 4 years, which has been working on principles as well. So, it's not the first time that we've been thinking about this. And again, we don't have all the answers, but we are really trying to get it right.
Yeah. So when you have got new technology, you release it to Kevin Roos and he will stress test it. Caitlin and Jason, you want to weigh in here? What's the appropriate role of corporations in kind of, solving problems that they may have created?
Oh, I don't know. Can I go back to the chat?
Sure, yeah.
I just wanted to say that I have my concerns about ChatGPT. I think it's a good example of a technology that has been deployed and monetized before we have regulatory processes in place, and even a better sense of what our ethical norms and values should be around its use. Even besides the data privacy, the disinformation, and the algorithmic bias concerns, which are plenty, the problem is in the short term, chatbots like ChatGPT aren't going to create new value, at least in the short term. In the short term, companies are going to use it to reduce costs. And this is especially true in industries like writing and journalism that are going to be the most heavily affected. I mean, we've already heard of BuzzFeed reportedly using ChatGPT to generate its like fun little online quizzes. And we know other outlets like CNET have also experimented with AI generated articles. And in years to come, I'm sure this trend will continue, especially as AI continues to advance. And we talk about protecting newsrooms and local news, but the reality is AI, cannot replace human journalists. And I am concerned about the potential implications of chatbots like ChatGPT on journalism, and related effects on society.
So David's organization is called All Tech is Human. So my riff on that will be, not only is all tech is human, but all tech should involve the humanities. And you may or may not be aware that the humanities in the United States and around the world are in crisis. History is the degree that has dropped the most of all degrees in the United States, okay? Fewer people are majoring in history than in religion or philosophy or linguistics. Nothing against those majors, they're great, but 33% decline. History departments are closing. History faculty are being laid off. If you look at other departments like philosophy, anthropology, sociology, this is also happening, right? And part of it is because the corporations have made such a push all the way from K through 12 for students to go into STEM. And the promise is that they'll get jobs and they'll get lots of money and they'll get, security. And so when I go to speak to high schools, I speak to 550 students and not a single one wants to take history classes when they get to college, okay? So what responsibilities do corporations have? Well, I think they have a responsibility to bring humanists into the conversation, to bring the humanities into the conversation and to invest in the humanities. Why shouldn't corporations be giving grants to humanities departments, history departments, anthropology departments to study the effects of tech? And yeah, that's happening in some places, but not enough to keep these departments afloat. Why aren't more humanities students being encouraged to pursue those majors and then being recruited by companies at career fairs in college saying, hey, we have a job for you when you get out. You don't have to major in STEM to work at Microsoft. You can actually major in ethics, and we'd love to have you on our team. That pipeline doesn't exist. And I see it firsthand from where I sit, and it's part of the reason that I do what I do. I want to get the humanities and history into the tech conversation, and I want to make sure that we have a tech future that not only retains its humanity, but doesn't destroy the humanities. So that's what I'm working on.
I love it, and the crowd does too. We're going to end there. Thank you to the panel. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.